share my screen with you, and hopefully I get some more, some quicker response on the screen. If you notice, the topic is blackness and racism in scripture, and the focus really is to just let us look into what the scriptures say as it pertains to blackness and racism. So my objectives, one, is to defend the integrity of the Christian Holy Scriptures, for sure. Secondly, is to debunk some misconceptions about the Bible's origin and agenda. And thirdly, to highlight the representation of Africanism in Scripture. And fourthly, is to challenge the Euro-American interpretation of blackness in Scripture. And finally, to inspire confidence in scriptural Black representation. As I said last week, I don't think I need to spend any time explaining why this is an important conversation to be having now. These postures I just want us to remind us of, for myself and for you, is that a topic like this requires us to approach it with a certain amount of humility, balancing off with pride. So that tension between humility and pride, between the fact that we want to be humble as we interact with this material, but at the same time, we want to be able to do so with a certain amount of pride in ourselves as a people. People are from the continent. But those tensions have to be held together. And then there's a tension between knowledge and ignorance. We can assert what we know for sure, but then we have to make allowance that there are things we may not know, there are things we're not certain about, and we have to hold those together too. And then there's the personal and the communal. And what I mean by that is, as we study scripture, yes, there's a way for us to read scripture as an individual and come to our conclusions as an individual, but then we have to remember that there's also a community of faith, and that the wisdom of that community should help to bear on our understanding and our conclusions as well. And that community is then the church on the whole, includes people of color, people of all races. So those are things. We talked about the map for the regions when we talk about Africanism in scripture. The region we're involved with is this region here circled by the red line. From the descendants of Noah, we have Shem, the region circled by that green line over. If you notice something, that there's a bit of overlapping between that red line and that green line. And that is a fact that we do have indications of some of the descendants of Ham reaching across in this area over here. So that's why there's an overlapping right here. For those who remember doing sets in maths, you will know what that means. And if you notice also, there's a bit of overlapping where Canaan right here is concerned, see? Because when we think of Africa, and if you notice in my chart before, where I have descendants of Ham, Cush, Put, Mizraim. Remember, Mizraim is Egypt. That's the Hebrew term for Egypt. And then Canaan. And you'll wonder, well, why do I have Israel here as part of Africa? What I want to show you by that then is that the descendants of Ham did occupy this region here. See where it takes in Canaan here. And remember the passage we look at in Chronicles where it says that when the children of Simeon came across into the land, the passage makes it plain that the region that they went into, the former inhabitants of that region were the Hamites, the descendants of Ham. So the Hamites, the Cushites, because Cush is a descendant of one of the sons of Ham. And so the Cushites, the Hamites, are the people who occupied this region. And throughout history and contemporary, they're known as the burnt people, the dark-skinned people, the people whose skin looked like it was burned by the sun. Thus, naturally, then they're living in this region. You can see why. So I wanted to pay attention to the overlapping then. So when we talk about Africanism or Hamite, Cushite peoples represented in the Bible, don't let us confine it then just to the borders of Africa. But you notice it pushes over a little bit over here into this these Arab areas Shem was, and you see have an overlap into where Israel, that Palestinian area, is concerned as well. That is, I think that's important for us, so we can know the breadth then of this boundary as far as the biblical narrative is concerned. Okay, we talk a lot about Nimrod. I don't need to spend much time going on that unless somebody have a question about it. That was a big part of our conversation last week as to why Nimrod is spoken about the way he's spoken about. Now, Thaddeus, you asked a question. Well, there are two questions I want to kind of respond to as we go forward because they came out of the discussion last week. So housekeeping matters. Then the question I got was, remember we talked about this representation here, where in Jeremiah chapter 46, for the most part, Jeremiah mentions this word here, the Gibborim. Gibborim is plural. So that is why when you read King James and he talks about the cherubim, there's no such thing as cherubims or seraphims. Cherubim is plural. So the King James missed that. The singular is Gibor. The way you pluralize in Hebrew is to put the im suffix at the end, and that makes it plural. So there's no need to add an s to that. So, so the Gibor, the Giborim, is a hero, is a warrior, is a mighty man of valor. And my contention last week, as we talked about it, was when Gibor is used in reference to the children, the Hamite people, there's a tendency in translations to describe them not as warriors or heroes, but as brutal, terrible. It's just this overture that these are like people to somehow, they are wicked people. And I find that very unfair to some extent. And so a question was asked then. Brother Tony, I see your hand. I'll just allow it. It seems like a pressing issue.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Can you go ahead and launch the slideshow by selecting the menu option slideshow?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for that. How do I do that again?
So go to the menu option that says slideshow.
Slideshow, yeah.
Across the top.
And then go over to current slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, brother. You guys are awesome. I will do this kind of thing with you all the time. Thank you. All right. So where was I now? So this thing here, and so the question was, because remember my contention and my argument is this: they attempt to minimize Africanism or to ignore, to overlook, is not an issue of, it's not the scripture. This is part of the whole thesis of this presentation, is that as far as the scripture is concerned, Africanism is represented in the scripture, no uncertainty. But it has been obscured because of the people who have been doing our translations and our interpretations for years, particularly from the Middle Ages, the 1500s, between the 1500s to the 1900s, where this white supremacy thing was very prevalent. And so you see that in some of the translations where when Gibor is used for the Israelites or for the Greeks or for the other nations apart from the Hamite Cushite people, the word is more used in the sense of a hero. They are heroes, they are great men of valor, they are warriors. But when sometimes it's used to represent the Cushite people, the Hamite people, the language becomes more coarse. They're more described as terrible and brutal and wicked people. And the reason for that, I believe, and some have contended, is because of the effort on the part of the Euro-American people who were moving into Africa and just wanted intentionally to minimize the African sense of self and pride. And so there was an attempt to even minimize that representation in scripture. And this is what this whole presentation is about, to kind of lift some of those things. So so this is the passage, First Chronicles 4:40, that when the children of Simeon went into Canaan, which is under the Israel, they got into the land there. The text says that the former inhabitants there, meaning the former inhabitants of the land that the children of Simeon, the descendants of Simeon entered, belong to, and I leave that there for you to fill that in, just to kind of get you engaged in it. The Hamites, the Cushite people, they were there. So literally then, the descendants of Ham was in the region we now call Israel, where the children of Abraham went into, the 12 tribes. That region was already formerly inhabited by the Hamites, who are the descendants of Cush. All right, which is significant for us, and we talked a lot about this. I don't want to spend much time about that again, unless somebody has something to ask. If you get the chance to view the recording for last week, you will see the explorations about that. And so for housekeeping matters, Thaddeus, that question then about do we see then how Gibor is translated, and if I need to, Thaddeus, if you need to correct my understanding of your question in any way, feel at liberty, brother, to do that. But if I understand you, you're saying, okay, the whole European work with translation and interpretation of scripture, that we see this anti-Black or this attempt to minimize Africanism or Blackness, really came around between the 1500, 1900s, when all these European archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists were going into Africa, and really to subjugate, to take possession of, to depossess, if you want to use those words. So your question is, do we see how Gibor, is there any representation of how Gibor is translated in translations before, say, the 1500s, 1600, before the 1500s? And so I look at it in some ways, and I asked one of my graduate colleagues, who is much more into ancient language and translations than I am. He was kind enough to do that and shared with me some information, and he clearly is in agreement with us. And I'll say he's a white guy, so I put that order just for, so you know, he's not another Black person just trying to speak along our line. He's a white brother, and he agrees with us, agrees with my take on this. So he shared with me some information which I want to share with you then. So this is what he says: the LXX, for those who don't know what the LXX is, the LXX is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures done around 250 BC before Christ. That's the Bible that Jesus then would have used, and that's the Bible his disciples would have used. So the LXX is called the Septuagint, and that is the translation that the Jewish people in the first century would have read, for those especially who did not read Hebrew. As a matter of fact, that's the reason it was done. There were so many Jews in the diaspora who didn't read Hebrew. They were Greek-speaking Jews, and so they needed to have their scriptures in a translation. And so around 250, it is believed that this translation was commissioned to have the scriptures of the people translated from Hebrew to Greek. So it's interesting to see then how they render this word, the Gibor. And so he says they render it as iskoroi. That's the Greek word for strong, iskorios, for strong. So they render it as the strong ones. Then you don't see this brutal bitterness in it either. They are the strong ones, they are fighters. Maketes. So they are, this is the Greek rendering then of Gibor. So the translators of the LXX, when they're translating Gibor, they render it with this word, which means the strong ones, the fighters. Again, you don't see this wicked, terrible, brutal reference. The Latin Vulgate, Jerome translated it as fortis, which is the Latin for strong. All right. Jerome translations are done like the 4th century. you know. So you are looking at before the middle of the 1st century that these translators are translating Gibor without this nuance of them being terrible, wicked, brutal people. They were just strong people, strong fighters. The Targum, for those who know what Targum is like an Aramic translation of Greek scriptures. So Targum Jonathan Jumai says, uses the Aramic pointing of Gibor in each instance. So they render it in the Targum. It is rendered in the meaning of Gibor, which is warrior, hero, without this nuance of them being people like they're just wicked, terrible people. Martin Luther, he even went to explain to me in his reference that Martin translated Gibor with the German hell, which is hero, or the strong one. So Martin translation, 16th century then, you know, you see this sense then that Gibor just points to people who are strong and heroic fighters and warriors, without the nuance then that they are the adjectives of them being terrible or wicked or brutal. I don't know if that helps it at us. The point is we were not able to get, I don't read Syriac, so I was not able to follow where the Syriac translation would render that. And my friend I asked, he told me he couldn't get his hand on the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Peshitta, because of course our library, he's on campus, but he says the library, of course, he doesn't have access to it. So we were not able to get to look at those documents particularly. But I think this kind of helped you then to see that during the early period, then this is how Gibor is rendered. It doesn't have that nuance then of the wickedness that we see. Yes, Brother Thaddeus, that's good?
Yes, 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 very good.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly what I was aiming at. Thought it would be very interesting to see how it was rendered in the earlier translations before the
right.
Yeah. Thank you
well,
very
before
much.
that Middle Age European influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And then there was another question that somebody asked. I think it was Paul Blake, but he's not on. He was asking me to make, if I can make some comments about the African Heritage Bible. Well, the African Heritage Bible is not really a translation issue. It is King James. The African Heritage Bible is a King James translation. So it's the same translation. So you're not going to see anything different in terms of the translation. Where the African Heritage Bible then has its appeal for people of color is in its comments. It is the commentary within the text or within the Bible. The footnotes, just where they explain things. And so it's a pro-Black, pro-African annotated Bible. When I first saw it and encountered it in Jamaica in the Bible Society and Source of Light bookstores, it basically paint everything black. The angels black, Moses black, John the Baptist black, you know, everything black. I think even the linen cloth that wrapped Jesus probably was black. That was a joke. All right. So that is this, and this is what I'm saying now. We don't need to go to that extreme or to that polarization to then make everything in Scripture black. I think that is something we need to avoid, or we have to try and avoid. That it's not everything then in the Bible that's black. And I've seen some comments that say, well, they talk about the African origin of the Scriptures. Something like that we kind of have to be careful with. And those are then extremes that I do not really think are healthy, because I don't think they're right. We can assert then our representation as people from Africa or of African descent. Well, let me just use the biblical language. People of Hamite, Cushite descendancy. I am glad to see that Dr. Chris Curry is on. I hope he still stays on, because he shared with me some things that I really want to include in this presentation as well. So that's what I also the African Heritage Bible. So it's not, you're not going to see anything different than King James in the translation in terms of then how Africanism is represented in the Bible, because the African Heritage Bible is a King James translation. It's just then in terms of the commentary. And we always tell people, Bible commentaries are comments within a Bible are just that. It's just somebody else's perspective. And so if you pick up certain Bible that have comments in them, the comments have their own biases. And so I think the African Heritage Bible has its own pro-African heritage or influence or bias that we have to then be balanced out with the truth or the facts as they may appear. Okay, and there's this caution that I mentioned, which I want to repeat here because I think it's important. Anachronism. In theological circles, it is more known as semantic anachronism. And that really is reading into ancient texts, modern day ideas or understandings of words or concepts. And then you ascribe to the ancient writer that understanding that we have today. So when you do that, there's really, it's because it's not right. The biblical writers, they would not have your idea. They would not have your definition. And we can't impose our ideas and our definition on them. So it is, I think D.A. Carson in his book, Exegetical Fallacies, says that is one of the main fallacies of translators, if you then do this anachronistic reading. There's an example that Carson mentioned that I've seen elsewhere, which I'll just show you what it means. Like the Greek word dunamis, I have done it, and that's why I raise it, because I know I have done it too. As a young preacher, I'll pick up the vines and I'll say, oh, well, dunamis, when Paul says I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, but it is the power of salvation. We say dunamis there is from the word, we get our word dynamite. And so we think Paul is saying that the gospel is the dynamite. Well, if you really think of what Paul is saying, dynamite would not really be a good picture for what he's communicating there. So that is an anachronistic reading. We are now conveying our idea of a dynamite into Paul's mind. And Paul would not know anything about a dynamite. So those are just, Chris now, he had sent me a note, and I'm glad he's on so he can speak for himself. So I'm saying now that the anachronism for our conversation for this has to do with how we see racial vocabulary. When we look at words like slave and master, we have to be careful we don't infuse those words with our modern understanding of slavery and masters, the American type of slave master type relationship, if you understand what I mean. So we have to watch our vocabulary and sentiments that we're not transferring, we're not doing Bible reading anachronistically, so to speak. Now, Chris shared with me something, and he was saying, he was on, I think early on when we met last week, and this is something he shared with me, and I put his name there. For those who don't know who Chris is, Chris Curry is, he's a history professor at the University of the Bahamas. So that's his work, that's his field. And so he says that what I refer to as anachronism, he's saying that in his field, history, they refer to it as historic presentism. And it is the idea is that we must be careful not to judge the past, including biblical texts and history, based on contemporary ideas, values, and standards. You say you can't transfer those ideas back into the text. If they are present in the text, fine. If it so happens that our ideas are then ideas in the text, then fine. But we have to make sure that it is not that we are reading, imposing our modern ideas and values and standards on the biblical text. So I wanted to make sure that I kind of bring some clarification of that. Now, Dr. Curry, if you are on and you want to just say something about that, make sure I represent what you're saying fairly. I'll give you the chance, sir.
Yeah, you did can everyone hear me?
Yes.
You did an excellent job, and I'm grateful that you presented it as such. I think it's a parallel concept to anachronism, as you suggest. Mm-hmm. Though with my particular discipline, we're looking maybe at a broader issue, mm-hmm. where in history we find the temptation to judge the past based on contemporary standards. Mm-hmm. I'll give a basic example. Oftentimes when we talk about indigenous cultures of the Caribbean, mm-hmm. Whether we're talking about the Taino-speaking Arawaks of the Greater Antilles or the Kalanajos of Dominica, we might be tempted to to judge their cultural practices based on what we do. So the fact that maybe they beautified their bodies or used various ways of decorating themselves to prevent insects from biting them, we might say, oh, well, you know, that's terrible. That's horrible that they didn't wear clothes like we do. That may be that's a very basic example of historic presentism, where we're judging their culture and their practices based on our modern concepts of apparel, and we would wear or spray something on us like insect repellent, whereas with them they were more creative and resourceful, using berries and juice from leaves to rub on their bodies to keep themselves from being bitten by mosquitoes. So that's just an example outside of biblical text as how historic presentism might operate. But it's the same kind of root idea, in that you're thinking about being careful about judging texts from our present contemporary culture, and being careful to look at the text within the period in which it was written.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that is it. And so that is why I'm saying no, especially for our conversation and for us, when we read in the New Testament then about slavery and about master and people obeying your master and subject to slave is subject to your masters, we have to be careful we're not reading into the text our understanding of slavery, as slavery was practiced by the Europeans and especially the American slavery system. Because slavery in the New Testament, for example, the slaves were of the same class, for example. Unlike the American system where the slave was black and the master was white. Slavery in the New Testament, the same class of people were enslaved. So it's where a Roman enslaved a Roman, okay? It's where a white man then enslaved a white man. So that feature then, so when we talk about slavery in the New Testament, and we think only slavery as we understand it from the American experiment with slavery, our experience with slavery, then we are doing an injustice to the biblical representation of the concept of slaves in that society. And I'll just use as an example. So thank you, Dr. Curry. I don't know if there's anybody who missed something they just want to clarify on something, I'll do that. Hopefully we can, I hope that what we say makes sense. And Dr. Curry, thank you so much for staying on and helping me with this. So that's what I'm saying. With those kind of words, slavery and master examples, servants, let us make sure we're not coloring those when we read the biblical text with our modern ideas of slavery and master in the text, because in many cases it's not so. All right, and I want to then move on now to, we're going to look at New Testament. Sister Val, you have your hand raised.
Did you just ask if someone wanted to go over?
Who's speaking?
This is Sister Val. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I was wondering, did you just ask a question that if someone missed something to go over it? I
if
just wanted
something that I may have just said and you want me to clarify it.
No, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so I want to look into, what we're going to do this week is to look into the New Testament representation of Africanism. And again, Dr. Curry shaded me an article, something he produced, which basically, when I looked at it, I said, man, all I needed to do was to share this with everybody and I didn't need to have this class, right? And I have the link in there, Dr. Curry, and I'll share it. It's amazing how your thoughts and the thoughts I have just almost follow the same trajectory. So it's good. I really appreciate that. But I want us to just look at some quotations. Remember now that we have looked at the Old Testament treatment of it, and we're moving into the New Testament, and I'm saying squarely that this type of attempt to minimize Africanism, to ignore it, to downplay it in scripture is really an effort on the part of the Europeans during this period as a part of their attempt to just kind of minimize blackness, minimize black people, take away our self-esteem and our whatever. James Cone, if you don't know who James, he's the father of black liberation theology, so to speak. James Cone was a professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. So he really is the man who led African liberation theology. And in his book, God of the Oppressed, This is something he wrote. So this is somebody who's not just, I just want to understand who he is. I think he was professor of systematic theology at Union. And so this is what he says here. Because, and watch the language again, because most biblical scholars are descendants of the advantaged class. You see? Because most biblical scholars are descendants of the advantaged class, it is to be expected, see, it is to be expected they would minimize Jesus's gospel of liberation for the poor by interpreting poverty as a spiritual condition unrelated to social and political phenomenon. When I read that, I can't help but think of how some political streams of American government think, where they don't see the relation between the social and political factors with certain people. And this is what Cohn is saying as a Black liberation theologian, that the biblical scholars who are descendants of the advantaged class, you can't expect them to then interpret and translate scripture without doing this. All right. So if you can get that book, I put the book and page there just to make sure that the integrity of the information is maintained. Then Richard Kapuscinski, I read this last week, I want to read it again. Kapuscinski was a Polish, journalist, but he traveled Africa a lot. And in his encounter with the Africans, it became clear to him that the European image of Africa, the European take on Africa, the European idea of what Africanism is and what Africa is and what the African people are like. He did quite a number of lectures. This was a lecture he did in Vienna, I think in about 1999 or something. Kapuscinski died, I think, early 2000, something like that. But so here's a European writing about his take on how the European view the African and kind of where we are. So he says, at the end of the European Middle Ages and at the start of modern times, Europe's great expedition to conquer the world, watch this now, the expedition to conquer the world, enslaved the other. Now, the other for Kapuscinski is the non-European, the non-white. That could include the Latinos, where he traveled a lot, Africans, where he traveled a lot, and Asians. He just grouped them as the other, meaning they are other than European. And he says that the expedition to conquer the world also involved the enslavement of the other and to pillage his possessions, which the African continent has experienced probably more than any other continent. They wrote pages of blood and cruelty into the history of our planet. The scale of genocidal practices in that era, which lasted for more than 3 centuries, would not be surpassed until the 20th century, when it would take the macabre form of the Holocaust. Watch this, and the underlinings are mine, just for emphasis. The image of the other that Europeans had when they set out to conquer the planet is of a naked savage, a cannibal, and a pagan, whose humiliation and oppression is the sacred right and duty of the European, who is white and Christian. Kapuscinski, this is strong language, but as one who traveled Africa and see the interaction in Africa, see what Africa is like, one who comes out of that European world and is able to write this way, says something. All right, and that's what I'm saying. So there has been a genuine effort. I don't know if it's a genuine effort, but a certain effort on the part of the people who are doing Bible translations and interpretations for us to minimize and downplay and just kind of take away the African sense, the Hamite Cushite sense of identity in scriptures. Look at this one now. I hope I can get this thing moved from here. This I find, let me explain something here. Philip Lokel, Philip Lokel, this is his dissertation for his doctoral work. He did a doctorate in theology with the University of South Africa. And I have a copy of his doctoral thesis, and I find it very useful. And I want to just share with you this part of it. So if you notice, the title of it at the bottom is The Importance and Challenges of Finding Africa in the Old Testament, the Case of the Cush Text by Philip Lokel. And when we talk about Cush text, then we're talking about those Old Testament texts that, like we've looked at, Isaiah, Jeremiah, those texts that talk about Genesis that reference Cush, the descendants of Noah, Ham, and Ham's descendants, the Cushites. And so this is what he says here, which I find useful. The thrust of this study proceeds from the proposition that first, the Cush texts of the Old Testament, which may be used as a conduit for finding Africa in the Bible, have been generally ignored or not given the priority they deserve, especially by traditional Western biblical scholarship. Remember what Cohn says, okay? Second, that when, however, they have been accorded a token paragraph or two, meaning the Cushite text, when they have been accorded a token paragraph or two, the interpretations given more often than not tend to portray a negative image of the African Cush. As a result, those of African ancestry who tend to trace their identity, however that term is understood, and historical roots to the biblical Cush, tend to take offense at such interpretations. They perceive them as a deliberate attempt to de-Africanize or de-emphasize the African presence in and contribution to the Bible. This thesis argues that there are serious consequences for de-Africanizing the Bible, especially for the African peoples. And this constitutes the fundamental argument in chapter 1, which is chapter 1 of his doctoral dissertation. I don't need to read the rest, but you can see then that this is what Cohn is saying too, and this is what even some of our white brethren have accepted, that there has really been an intention to somehow minimize, you can't remove it, but you can kind of overlook it. You can kind of minimize it. You cannot give it any emphasis. As he says, they have really done so intentionally. But if you notice what he talks about here, the traditional Western biblical scholarship, which is the scholarship of the predominant European Americans between the 1500s, 1900s. Here is something I find I wanted to look at too then. Now, this is Lord Macaulay in his address to the British Parliament in 1835. Okay, see? February 1835, his address to the British Parliament. I have traveled across the length and breadth of Africa, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief, such as wealth I have seen in this country. Such high moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old and ancient educational system, her culture, for if the Africans think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. But you see that? Are we still here? I can't see everybody, you know, so it would be nice to know
yes. Yes.
We're still here. We're still here.
Okay, right. So, so look at that. 1835. So there was a clear intent then on the Europeans to do this to Africa. And since they were the ones who were doing our Bible translations and they were the ones who were doing our Bible interpretation for us, that is what Cone is saying. You can't expect them to African presentation in the scripture any kind of prominence or speak about it in any way that can be applauded. And thus, my friend who I tell you did some of that looking for me, he says to me clearly, looking at the renderings, the translators, the King James translators clearly had a bias towards rendering Gibor in the Cushite text in not very glowing ways, as they will do when they render Gibor in other texts. All right, so New Testament references, we move on here. Any question on anything we just shared? Anybody, if you just have a pressing question, could be quick and short. I just want to make sure if you have something pressing. If not, then we can leave it to the end. Okay, so